and the kid's reading at the first grade level, your job is to differentiate so that that kid will be able to interact with your core, with your textbook. Are you kidding? Why is that a fair thing to ask? Those kids are so far behind where they need to be that they need to have intervention that is much more intensive than a teacher should have to give them. So what we're suggesting to people is that they think a little bit differently about this. There's another reality in several places. And this is the other reality that exists in some schools and in some school divisions taken as a whole. And I'll tell you what, in some of the big city school districts in the United States, there are 70 and 80% of the kids who are in Tier 3. When that becomes true, that becomes the core curriculum for that school because those kids are so far behind. So what I ask you to think about as David gets ready to talk here is, how do you decide which kids need a Tier 1, a Tier 2, a Tier 3 intervention? The best thinking to date about that is this. And you can do this by looking at your data, mostly summative data actually. You can look at what percentage of your kids are achieving at the 50th percentile or above. Did that make sense what I just said? So percentile and percentage are different, right? So what percentage of your kids are achieving at the 50th percentile or above? Those are kids who you could predict will be able to make it with universal interventions, with differentiating instruction. Those kids who are achieving from the 50th percentile to the 30th percentile, so that range, are kids who will probably need a Tier 2 intervention, a strategic intervention of some sort that's skill-based. And those kids who are achieving below the 30th percentile, those are kids who are probably going to need an intensive intervention. So there's a big city district that I've interacted with lately that I was so disappointed in, I wanted to write a letter to the editor about what they decided. They have a math program that works very nicely for kids who are pretty naturally attuned to learning math. Then there are a group of kids who are in need of Tier 3 intensive math intervention because they're not going to be successful in algebra because they're so far behind as 6th graders. There's no way for them to be successful unless you intensively intervene with them at that point. So the special ed curriculum people in that district said, yeah, we got it. We're gonna go for your intensive math intervention that you guys publish. It's called Transitional Mathematics, and it's really cool, and it works, and all that, and they loved it. They brought in a couple of the math curriculum people, general ed people from the district, this big district, and they were into this model that for teaching math that was good for the kids who would learn with a cardboard cutout in front of the teacher, you know, in front of them, of the teacher in front of them, I should say. So they came in and they said, I'll tell you what, we've got this curriculum. We have some extra copies of it, and there's some extra stuff that we always throw away. We'll just piece together something for those special ed kids who need an intensive intervention. Now, here are the data. 8% of the students in that district are proficient in math. The number 8%. And they decided to use this curriculum that is not designed for an intensive intervention to use with those kids. And they kept their jobs, and they're still working toward retirement. That's not right, in my opinion. That is, as one researcher said, academic child abuse. Was I careful not to say the name of the district? Yes. Good, okay, good. I wanted to be sure that because I almost said it 5 times. Okay, so I don't want to say that. All right. So think about what your reality is, and now I'm going to turn it right to David, who's going to talk to you now about the use of technology within a multi-tier system of support.
Thanks, Steve. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. So as you've heard, my name is David Bradburn. And I just wanted to say, during Steve's presentation this morning, he had made reference to the very early kind of Kurzweil technology. Is there anyone in the room that actually knows what the Kurzweil reading machine is or was? Actually, that's more than I'm accustomed to seeing. So maybe Steve can just bring up our first image. He actually described it as being as big as a fridge. So this is, if you've not seen one before, this is a Kurzweil reading machine, model 400. Does anybody in the room that knows about this machine care to remember what they used to cost when they were for sale in the 1980s? How much do you think? You think 18,000, is that Canadian? Maybe it's a rhetorical question. I don't know what the exchange rate was. I will tell you that in the UK, it was around 35,000 US dollars. One of those. You can see that you got a little lid up here. You'd lift it up, you'd place your book inside, and on this keypad, which by the way had no writing on at all. In fact, the way we used to train, librarians typically were the ones that would end up using these machines. They were obviously sold for patrons who are blind, could come into the library and obviously read independently. It would actually take 2 days to train everybody, and we used to blindfold them. So they would actually have an appreciation of what it means to be blind, so that when you start to describe things, you think very visually or tactilely about what you're describing to people, which is why we would often get accustomed to saying, oh, it's as big as a washing machine. European front-loading variety. The US kind of top-loaders are like huge. If you'd show the next picture, Steve, it kind of just puts it into some perspective. I stand at about 5'11" and 6/5 or something. Anyway, there it is up to me, so it just comes up to about here. This machine, which I actually started working with in 1984, it weighs around 300 pounds, right? So, you know, typically when we get to like sites to do conferences and stuff, you'll see the nice ramps downstairs and like easy access to the building, buttons to hold the door open for you. I don't know about Canada. None of that existed in England in 1984. So invariably, when I'd arrive, of course, we'd always be told the exhibit was on the 3rd floor, up a narrow flight of stairs. Did I tell you that it weighs 300 pounds? So I wasn't the most popular person in the industry at that time, because when I would arrive someplace, I would go in search of 3 able-bodied volunteers to help me lift the thing. So it was huge. Nevertheless, at $30,000, how many of these do you think people would buy for a typical school? Just guesstimate. What do you think? None. That's absolutely right. In the 3 or 4 years that we were selling this model in the UK, I don't ever remember selling one to a school ever. There might have been a university along the way, but as far as like K-12 education as we know it, not a one. Now, if you consider, thank the good Lord, that Kurzweil 3000, which of course is the kind of the evolution of this technology, comes on CD. Actually, it'll very soon be coming on a single DVD, so rather than multiple CDs, you'll have just the one disc. And of course, if you think about pricing, so some of you, if you ever heard Ray Kurzweil speak many years ago, he would frequently speak about Moore's Law. This is after Dr. Moore from Intel, who obviously kind of spoke about the evolution of technology, how every 18 months everything gets twice as fast, half the price. And I think we've kind of proven that point absolutely works. Anyway, Steve, you want to just go back to the PowerPoint for me? That'd be great. So I wanted to kind of show that to you, if only just to kind of let you know that when I tell people I've been working with Kurzweil since they invented dirt, it's mostly true. So I want to start with a question for the group. This is not a rhetorical question. I would like to get feedback from everyone in the audience. The question of the day simply is this: what is technology? So when you read that question, you hear that question, what comes to mind? What do you think of? What's an example? Sir, what's an example of technology for you?
It really depends on the context. In my world, it's an IT manager, so in my world, it's another tool that I provide.
Okay, so in the world of IT, it's a tool. Okay, what else is technology, ma'am? A strategy for learning. Okay, what's another example of technology? A medium of learning. Okay. That's a very good answer. Yeah, things to make your life easier and faster. What about more specific answers? What else is technology? An iPod. That's a good one, yeah. iPod's definitely technology. What else? Speech-generating devices, otherwise known as text-to-speech. Yep. Anything else? All right. Well, I'm going to give you my answer. You ready? Now, I've actually written this on this slide. It's going to pop up when I click this button, which, by the way, is also technology. All right, are you ready? It's quite profound. It's anything invented after you were born. So just think about that for a second. So I can just, we don't have to get into how old everybody else is in the room, except for Steve, who is very old, as he's already clarified. But if I just think about me and my kids, I have 2 kids. I have an almost 19-year-old and an almost 16-year-old. And of course, for them, when they, you mentioned iPods, and I think of like cell phones and computers and all that stuff that they use. It's not technology for them. They're digital natives, right? They've been using this stuff. I can remember when my son was 18 months old. I'm a big video gamer, and so we've got Xboxes and PlayStations galore at home. And when my son was 18 months old, my idea of babysitting was just to stick a controller in his hand, which, by the way, was not connected to the PlayStation, but it kept him quiet, and he'd look at the screen as I would play. There were no shooting game allowed until he was 4 or 5, I think. But prior to that, it was just racing games with cars and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that by the time he was 3, he could race a car around a Grand Prix track in one of my computer games without any problem at all. My father, on the other hand, to this day, I think if he gets drunk, he actually does better. But if he's sober, it just doesn't work. And I think that kind of shows, when we talk about this closing the achievement gap, what about that technology gap? Because a lot of times, and we're going to get into this when we start talking about different implementations, when we come in contact with a lot of educators, it's much like everybody in the room here. We're not all as comfortable with technology as we think. And the reason, of course, is this, that most of it came after we were born. So if you have been accustomed to writing things on a board, or maybe you've been accustomed to using an overhead projector, right? Very different approaches to how some of us are being expected to teach today, and we'll get into some of those other types of technology examples in a second. So let's think about this for a second, right? So let's think about what we have today. So the computer was an answer that I might have thought someone might have shared before. I was interested that actually nobody did. You do have computers here, right? Oh, yeah, there's one here. Oh, my goodness.
Next to the dog
Yes.
sleds.
Thank you. Okay. Does it actually doubles as one? Maybe? Yeah, okay. So, you think about computers then. So, desktop computers. I actually remember, back in the day of the Kurzweil reading machine, the computer of choice back then was an IBM XT/AT. It was the bomb. That computer, oh my goodness. It had a floppy drive built in. I don't remember how much memory it had, but it certainly wasn't in the megabytes. It might have been 64. Nevertheless, I can remember training folks on early versions of Kurzweil speech recognition technology at that time. I took about 2 days of training for that product. It wasn't actually. The training as far as recording your voice took maybe 30 minutes. But it took that IBM 2 days to process everything that you spoke to give you that voice profile. And guess what? If you had a cold, something else happened that made your voice different than what it was when you trained it, you had to go back to the beginning and start all over again. It's pretty bad. Nevertheless, that was a big hunking thing. We're talking about the big monitors now. You think about these lovely, light, flat screen models that we have nowadays. Very different. Of course, the notebook computer, or very similar to the MacBook and so forth, those have been around for a while. They're certainly getting thinner and thinner. What about the netbook? Anybody here own a netbook computer? So a couple people have them. Did you say some of your kids have them? Your personal kids or the students in your district? Your personal kids? Both. And then we actually have one right here in the front. So maybe you can just kind of hold that up, sir, so everyone behind you can see it. So to give you an idea of size, so there is a netbook computer. I asked that question because the school district of San Diego Unified in Southern California last year actually, we're going to get into them in a second, but they actually purchased 117,000 netbooks, one for every student in their district. And they put Kurzweil 3000 on every single netbook computer so that every single student in the district is using the exact same technology. No ifs, buts, or maybes. We'll speak about them again in a second. Interactive whiteboards. How many of you, raise your hand if you've got a smart board or a Promethean board or an Interite board or whatever type of board it is you've got? How prevalent are they? Is there anyone here that actually has them in every classroom in the building? So some of you, about half your classrooms. I have to tell you, I think personally interactive whiteboards are probably one of the best things to ever happen to teaching. I love using them personally. In fact, if you ever see us at like exhibitions typically, we will invariably get a smart board inside the booth, because being able to kind of stand up here and kind of model by touching and interacting with the curriculum or whatever it is we're working with is so much more engaging to the folks watching than if we're just looking at some static display and I'm having to go back and forth from the computer, which would obviously be the case if I was doing it today. So PowerPoint. How many of you are using PowerPoint in school? Or how many of your colleagues are using PowerPoint? What about your kids? I mean, I'm guessing the students are using this, right? Anytime there's kind of a project where they're having to kind of put something together to be very